Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm Cathy Silber. I'm the director of the Granite State Fair Tax Coalition. I'd like to thank the Rockefeller Center for joining with us to bring you this event today, with special thanks to Sarah Morgan, Sadna Hall, and Professor Winters and Professor Sandwich. I'd like to take just a minute to tell you about the Granite State Fair Tax Coalition and our program today, and then I'll introduce our moderator and we'll get underway. Granite State Fair Tax Coalition is a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of organizations and individuals that reaches about 70,000 people around the state of New Hampshire. We believe that our state faces long-term budget problems that cannot be solved in short-term ways. New Hampshire is facing a budget gap projected to be at least $600 million in the next biennium. And while the recession is what makes the hole so deep, the fact is, as you'll hear shortly, our budget is designed with a built-in gap. Costs rise and our revenues don't keep up with the expenditures. We know this, and we think we need to be planning for it. As you'll hear this afternoon, we've got basically 4 options. Option 1 is we can plan to cut back on services whenever the need for them goes up or their costs rise. Option 2, we can reform our revenue structure so that it raises enough to fund our priorities. Option 3 is a combination of 1 and 2, reforming both spending and revenue with the needs of the times. And option 4 is to plan to do nothing and make our most important decisions as a state in crisis mode. The Granite State Fair Tax Coalition believes that the challenges of our state budget are complicated and too complicated for solutions that can be summed up in slogans. If it were easy, it would be fixed by now. We believe that effective solutions will come only out of open discussion and debate, with all views heard and all options on the table, and so that's our work, to foster a productive conversation about what we value as a state and how to pay for it. And that's what we're here for today, a productive conversation. The forum today is the 4th in a series of 7 around the state. We've done this now with a variety of panelists in Keene, Portsmouth, and Nashua in the last 2 weeks. Tomorrow we'll be doing one in Concord. October 14th we'll be doing one in Claremont and one in Plymouth. You can get the list in our newsletter on the literature table as you leave, and it's also on our website. Our moderator tonight is Richard Winters, Professor of Government here at Dartmouth. Professor Winters received his BA from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, an MA from the University of Hawaii, and his 1972 Ph.D. from Stanford. He has been teaching government at Dartmouth since 1969, has chaired the government department, and has served as director of this Rockefeller Center. His special fields of interest are American state politics, American political economy, social welfare politics, and the politics of the budgetary process. Professor Winters.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I told Cathy I was at Dartmouth when this building was designed. In fact, I served on the committee advising the architect, Lo Yi Chan, and I told her it's just going to be irresistible because I've been teaching here for so many years that I know I'm going to sort of prowl the aisles because that's what I ordinarily do when I'm teaching. So it's really a pleasure to have you all here, and what we're looking for is, I think, a wide-ranging discussion on the New Hampshire budgetary process, but also on the priorities for the state in terms of not only its taxing, but also we need to think about spending priorities as well. We have 3 first-rate panelists, and I think they fall into neat classes. Our first speaker, discussant, will be Steve Norton, who is Executive Director of the New Hampshire Center for Policy Studies, which is a private nonprofit firm. But Steve also worked for the state of New Hampshire for a number of years, including being director of the Medicaid program for the state of New Hampshire. And he currently serves on the Concord Zoning Board of Adjustment. So there's practical experience here as well as a long historical record of knowledge about state and local politics and state and local governments in New Hampshire on Steve's part, and he will start the panel off. Our second speaker is well known to many of you. Brian Walsh was a Dartmouth undergraduate. He went for a master's degree at Columbia University and then returned to the Upper Valley, where he's been involved in the private sector for 3+ decades, which involved founding 3 different firms in the private sector, and really is a well-established individual in research and development and technology in the Upper Valley. He chairs, as many of you know, the Hanover Zoning Board, Hanover Select Board, and has served on the Hanover Planning Board as well, and also serves, I think, on the board for the New Hampshire Center for Policy Studies, among a number of other nonprofit agencies that Brian has been involved in. So Brian has an extraordinary experience on the ground record here of how activities at the state level really directly affects the well-being of his constituents. And as well, Brian has a statewide view. He's been very active in statewide politics and statewide thinking and analysis about problems facing the state of New Hampshire. Our third panelist is Marilyn Bourne, who is also a longtime Upper Valley resident. She's also served on the Cornish Select Board for a number of years, so she has direct experience there in local government in Cornish. Her current position, and she's held since I think year 2000, is Executive Director of the LISTEN program in Lebanon. Many of you know it has a number of outlets. It undertakes a wide number of programs that directly affect the well-being of individuals who are actually in need of services in the Upper Valley. And she brings this kind of perspective here of what are some of the needs, the popular needs out there, and how are local and state and the federal governments really responding to these needs. And I think what's important, and because Marilyn has been the executive director now over the last 9 years of LISTEN, she has experienced both a boom period in the Upper Valley, but also has experienced real problems here as the economy has tanked, though less so in the Upper Valley relative to other parts of the state, other parts of New England. But nevertheless, the needs have really changed, and she's seeing this in the front lines. So we're going to start this panel out, and each panelist has 10, 15 minutes or so. Steve is going to start out with a PowerPoint presentation that looks at the budgetary picture, and then Brian will pick up with his reactions to what he sees happening not only in the Upper Valley but also in Concord and in Washington and Maryland will also respond. I might lob a question or two at the panelists at the end of their presentations, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I've been at Dartmouth College since 1969, so I have, I'm going to be retiring in a couple years, so I have no problem about cutting people off if you tend to wander on in your questions. So I will certainly sharpen whatever questions you might launch at the audience, launch at the panelists in an effort to really educate the audience and to further our discussion here about the budgetary future for the state of New Hampshire. So let me turn it over now to Steve, who will start off the program.
Thank you, Professor Winters. I always love coming up here for both professional and personal reasons. My professional reasons, of course, because there's an incredible intellectual community up here, but also personal. My father-in-law, Reverend Werewell, lives in Lebanon. He had the good graces to bring me over in his little red MG. So if you see me jumping that afterwards, I'm here. I'm going to try and be very quick. Numbers can be almost numbing in this process. The numbers are so large and the questions so uncertain about the future. But I do want to begin with something that our auditors of the state said in 1992 about the state, and that is that, in fact, we do consistently have a situation in which the revenue structure that we've crafted does not keep pace with the set of obligations, the social contract, if you will, that we've established with the citizens of New Hampshire and the expenditures that are required thereof. Now, in various time periods, we've had more of a structural deficit and less, depending on spending and revenue changes, but it's generally been consistently true that we are in a position of a structural deficit. And that's not inconsistent with many other states, but nonetheless remains true. Of course, The result of that is that every budget biennium, and for those of you that don't know it, we budget every 2 years for both our expenditures and what we anticipate for appropriations and revenues. We must play with this structure to meet the spending obligations and how they've changed over time. And that's illustrated by this graph. This begins in 1988 and says, what would happen if we changed nothing about tax rates or taxes in the state and just grew them as revenues grew, just that baseline. And you can see that in 1988 we had about $543 million in general fund revenues, and by 2010 that would have grown to $899 million. Now, that's not a small amount of growth. But the point of a structural deficit, of course, is the expectations and anticipation of expenditures grew much more quickly. And in fact, to meet our obligations in 2010, we had to have $1.4 billion worth of. So what did we do between that time period? Well, we increased rates. For example, the tobacco tax, we increased the rate at which we tax tobacco, among other things. We created a series of new taxes to meet those obligations. And then we did some interesting work with the federal government to draw down some additional enhanced matching dollars. You can see back in 1992, 93, there was a very large peak of money. That was something called Metascam. And that particular relationship that we've had with the federal government has brought in almost $2 billion of revenue to the state. And when we get to the point of what happens next, you're going to see that a lot of it and what happens next and what is going to be required of the state is going to be a function of what the federal government does with some of that money. Why is it so bad now? If we've had this structural deficit for so long, how have we managed to survive? Well, we've done that by tinkering in our revenue structure, changing our spending slightly, but this period is slightly different. This is the Great Recession, and I put 2 arrows there. The purple line represents how revenues have grown in the Education and General Trust Fund, and those are the 2 funds or accounts, if you will, that fund our general obligations and our obligation to fund an adequate education. The big increase between 2000 and 2001 was the result of the Claremont lawsuit, and the state had to come up with an additional $400 million in general tax dollars to support that. But in 2005, we raised $2.125 billion worth of general and education trust funds. It grew across the next 3 years, and then we hit 2008. And we saw revenues fall off considerably. And in fact, in 2010, we're only $13 million more in revenue than we were in 2005. So we know that the cost of business goes up. We know that in times of recession, the demands on state government increase. So we're being asked, in essence, to fund a set of obligations and contractual obligations that were established in the past with revenues that have actually fallen. That's the dilemma that we face today, and that's why I think the conversation about the structural deficit is in a little different place. If the economy had continued growing the way it had for almost 10 years, or 20 years since the previous recession in 1991, I'm not sure we'd be in this room in the same way, but we're in a different place now because of that. I want to talk a little bit about spending, that social contract, if you will, that the legislature establishes with the citizens of New Hampshire about what it's going to spend. We have a variety of programs that are established either by our Constitution or decisions that the legislature makes, and those include the establishment of the Medicaid program, which provides health care to low-income and disabled individuals, our retirement system, which provides retirement services to state employees and some local and municipal employees, and then a variety of education costs, including special education for those that very difficult to educate students with disabilities, school building aid, which provides some capital for local schools to build and upgrade their facilities in the Department of the Corrections. If you look over the last 10 years, and you group those by these particular categories, only those 5 major areas of the state government have seen an investment in an inflation-adjusted per capita basis. What that means is that these programs have crowded out investment in everything else. Everything else includes capital development for municipal water treatment. It includes a variety of economic development initiatives that used to exist under the Division of Resource Economic Development. Things that people felt were important or critical to the state, but they couldn't keep pace with inflation or the needs because of this imbalance, the structural imbalance. It represents the decision-making of the legislature and to some extent the voters. This crowding out effect is going to be exacerbated now because those drivers, the Medicaid system, has seen an 8% increase in caseloads over the last 2.5 years. The demand for those services actually increased. The retirement system is currently underfunded, the fourth least funded retirement system in the country, and we're continuously seeing increases in the requirements for state and local investment. And our obligations in education continue to increase. That means all those other things we're going to see even less. That's the manifestation, one of the manifestations of the structural deficit. One of the other manifestations of the structural deficit is actually something that most would consider is a good thing, and that is that we as a state really look carefully every 2 years at every program. So while there are significant problems with this, there are some structural results that need to be considered when you think about that structural deficit. So we know we have a structural deficit. We know revenues have fallen off the table, if you will. I feel terribly for Representative Almy, who's chaired the committee that has dealt with this issue largely. We know that expenditures are going to continue to increase absent significant reductions in expenditures. What does that mean? Well, this is a complicated graph saying we don't really know. The black line represents growth in expenditures anticipated. The green shows the regular general fund taxes and then the other sources of taxes above that. I want you to look in the upper right corner, right next to that little red blob, if you will. That little red blob represented the appropriation that was established for 2010 and 11, which included a significant amount of one-time monies and monies from the JUA, which was a joint underwriting association that had about $100 million of assets that the state was interested in appropriating for its own uses. All of that money may have to be replaced. And when you hear Cathy speak about the problem in 2012 and 2013 as a $600 million problem, that assumes that all of that money, all that federal dollars, has to be replaced. It also assumes that there are a series of budgetary changes that were made in the past that aren't going to be made again. That is, that we're going to start funding the local towns and communities at the level they were in the past. That might happen, they might not. In the work that we're doing, we're saying this problem in 2012 and 13 is somewhere between $250 million and $600 million, depending critically on what the federal government does with the stimulus dollars and what the legislature does with programs that are due to sunset. It's a big problem. And when you look at it, in terms of magnitude, it's at least as large as the problem the governor had to deal with in the last budget biennium. What that means is that process that we just went through, the very difficult conversation about spending and revenues, is going to happen again. That's really the question going off into the future. Now, I've got a series of backup slides in case we get some questions, which I think we might, about particular aspects of the state and spending and so forth. But with that, I'll pass it on to Brian Walsh, I think.
Yes.
All right.
Please, Brian.
Thank you, Steve. First, I'd encourage you all to go to the New Hampshire Center for Public Policy Studies website, become a member, become a contributor, and get to know what we know about this state. Steve has done incredible work. It's probably the best knowledge of this state we've ever had relative to, and this is honest work. This is not from the left side or the right side or the upside or the downside. So I encourage you to get connected with the Center for Public Policy Studies. Now, I want to apologize in advance to the roughly 10% of the crowd here who are in the state legislature now or have been in the state legislature, and I guess I'll apologize to all of you who might be in it. If I say anything that offends you, my apologies. It's not intended to be personal, but I do have some observations which many of you have heard before. I've been watching the state through the lens of the town's budget for 14 years, and I've been watching it through the lens of the state's budget and its budget setting processes for that long at least. And I have some prejudices. But first I want to start with some details. So this is right down in the line item detail of the Hanover town budget. There are roughly 5 items that are directly related to the state of New Hampshire's budgetary decisions. The state has four sources of revenue that historically, expenses to the state, revenue to the town that they have historically paid, a portion of the rooms and meals tax, a piece of the highway trust fund for roads, municipal revenue sharing, and a retirement system contribution for the retirement system for local employees. And those, there's also another piece that's very direct, a direct link between the state and the town's budget, and that's the requirement for contributions to the retirement system for local employees that the town must make on its own side, which is set by the New Hampshire retirement system, but fundamentally which is established by the state legislature and the benefits which they create. In the past 2 years, the town of Hanover's tax rate's gone up by roughly 2.5% a year because of direct actions by the state, reducing revenues to the town or increasing expenses to the town. So you can think of, at least I think of, the state as using the property tax to fund part of its deficit. And that has been going on, but not quite as directly traceable as I could then for a number of years. Secondly, there's another line item which is really important, and it's what I'll call contributions to social service agencies. This is the VNA, this is West Central, this is WISE, this is those agencies who do the social services for the people of either this town or our valley, and it's a payment to them to pick up essentially what the state has stopped paying over time. And that number has grown over the years. Not dramatically, it's about 1% of Hanover's budget. The schools, there are 3 places of real connection, and I don't know the school budgeting as well as I should for this conversation. One is special education. Steve pointed out that it's the 3rd fastest growing portion of the state budget. It's also a portion that the state works very hard to keep under control, and it's a big piece of the school district budget as well, and there's contention there, and what gets pushed onto the property tax, I'm not sure. The state building aid for schools as well, which is I think it was the 3rd or 4th, the 4th most rapidly growing one. There's been conversation in the legislature of completely eliminating that. Now that would be for new schools, but I was having a conversation with Marilyn somebody from Grantham and Sarah, and that's going to say essentially that towns and cities that need new schools are going to have to pay them all themselves rather than the roughly 40% the state has paid. And lastly, the conversation we had for a decade, which was what is the state's responsibility for education and how will it be paid for? And you've probably all seen go and come on your property tax bill the state education property tax with some varying names. That funding formula changes every other year, every 3rd year. And it's not, if I was in the legislature, I'd tell you it was driven by equity. If I'm in a town, I'm telling you it's going to be driven by just political horse trading to get the votes to pass something. And it often passes in June, which unfortunately happens to be 2 or 3 months after all the school budgets are set in March. So it makes it a very difficult set of fiscal gymnastics that the school districts have to do. I want to switch from the numbers for a minute to donor towns and equity among municipalities in the pledge. Three slogans that we've heard a lot, at least on bookends on it. We're lucky in Hanover. We have a strong property tax base. It has been growing until quite recently. That's allowed us to do things. Very few towns are in that position. And it's been much, much, much more difficult for most of the municipalities of the state, even before the Great Recession, and now to support the services that are expected or needed, especially on the school side. In the education funding, it led to a concept of donor towns. And I really reject donor towns. Towns don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. Individuals pay taxes and businesses pay taxes. And if you're in Hanover and you're old and you're on a fixed income and your house value has gone up a lot, even though we are able to abate some of that or substantial portions of that, you still get squeezed as taxes go up. And as taxes get pushed down from the state level, it gets harder and harder. So don't think of donor towns. Think of taxes as flowing through to people as you think about the way the state should be taxing. And think about taxes flowing through to businesses. And the pledge, no new taxes. No, how long have we heard no new taxes from Concord? I want to sort of wander through that. Steve, first of all, went after the no new taxes side. We've had many, many, many new taxes. So really it's no new broad-based taxes or no new state broad-based taxes. But it's really gone beyond that because we do have a broad-based tax in this state. It's called the property tax. And every time the state essentially takes an action, and I'm not going to use the word downshifting because the state can take lots of actions which are different from downshifting, but takes an action that requires higher property taxes at the municipal level. In fact, the state is using a broad-based tax, and it is increasing a broad-based tax, and that's a tax that we all pay called the property tax. Now, there's a real advantage to the state in doing this because the state of New Hampshire doesn't send the bills. I get a chance to send the bill for Hanover, and that really makes me angry that I get to send a bill to you all for the state where, in fact, the state can stand up there and say, we have no new broad-based taxes. I want to look at the counties for a minute, which is another view and probably the one that's hardest to see on the one hand, but the most egregious in my view. Nobody looks at the counties in the state of New Hampshire. But if you look at the actions that have been taken by the state government over the past 10, 20 years, essentially eliminating mental health services at the state level, much of that service requirement has shown up where? Well, it's shown up in the county jails, interestingly enough. When somebody has difficulty of a mental health nature and they can't access a social service agency, they go to the county jail. Now, the state also has chronically underfunded alcohol and drug abuse treatment. Where does that end up? That ends up in the county jail, too. And I'm going to take one more piece of the county jail for a minute. As the state court systems are unfunded or underfunded, and it was a shame that we lost Chief Justice Broderick. He was probably one of the greats in the state, I think we're going to find over time. But he left because he wasn't going to sit there and be the guy who brought the state court system down. But as the state court system is unable to process cases, most of the people who aren't charged with severe felonies stay in the county jails. Now, you in Grafton County, and it's been true in Sullivan County too, know that there's been a great hue and cry and need to increase the county jail. Part of it, in our case in Grafton County, is because it was 100 years old. But part of it, if you go back and look over the record, it's because we had to take on those responsibilities of rehabilitation and of housing and of warehousing people because the state had gone out of those businesses. The same is similarly true in the world of Medicaid. Medicaid is a state program, and much of it's, some of it's paid for, some of it's not paid for, and some of it's, in fact, shifted to the counties. You remember the county home? In the olden days, my mom used to talk about going to the county home. Well, the county home now is the county nursing home. It's the biggest expense, I think, in the county budget, though the jail may be close to it. And the state has worked its magic changing the formula of what's the responsibility of the county and what's the responsibility of the state over the past few years, so that at least my judgment is those areas that are going to grow most quickly lie on the property tax, and those that are going to grow most slowly lie in the state budget. Interesting. The other piece on Medicaid is that as Medicaid is unfunded or underfunded, the problems that those people face don't go away. In fact, they get picked up typically by DHMC, at least in our area, 100% virtually by DHMC, downstate by some other hospitals. And lo and behold, they're paid by you and me who have private health insurance, because the cost of taking care of those people is cost shifted, and the center has some great reports on this, to individuals or businesses with private health insurance. I had one other, and I can't remember what it was, quite frankly now, and I could read it, but, oh, the retirement system. I don't want to go into the retirement. You don't want to hear me talk about the retirement system now. But the retirement system is another place where the state sets the rules and creates expenses that fall on the property tax. So I would ask you all, as you hear people say, no new taxes, I'd like you to hear something different. It's like we are really using the property tax as the broad-based tax in many ways, or we're using the private insurers in some other places to fund state obligations, but we're not going to tell you about it because it would be uncomfortable. So that's my view from the local level, and it's been a pleasure.
Well,
well, I'm not an economist. I have been a select person. I share a lot of Brian's views. But I work with some of the most impoverished people in our county, in Grafton County, right here in the Lebanon, Hanover area. We also work with residents of Vermont who are in the same dilemma. And I see what happens on a regular basis when states need to decide what to do about services and balancing budgets. A perfect example would be a 25-year-old individual with a 3-year-old child who is making roughly $24,000 a year in income, having to pay $800 or $900 a month rent here in the Upper Valley, or having to live well outside the Upper Valley to be able to find affordable housing at $600 a month, and then having to pay for transportation, having to pay for child care, eats up more than 3/4 of this individual's annual income. And what I found out today when I went to the DHHS, Department of Health and Human Services website for the state of New Hampshire, I used a calculator to try to find out what sort of assistance this individual can receive from the state of New Hampshire. And after filling in all the little boxes, stating what the income was, stating what the expenses were, coming out with $3,000 to take care of clothing, food, gasoline, and medicines at the end of the year, I found out that that person wouldn't qualify for food stamps in the state of New Hampshire. And yet they're at about 171% of poverty. And New Hampshire states that those individuals living between poverty and 185% of poverty are eligible for food stamps. But the practicality is that when you get down to do the details, for some unknown reason, and no one in DHHS could explain to me why, this individual wouldn't receive help. Then I tried it in another state. I was curious, well, what would happen if you were a resident of Massachusetts? And using the same calculator, but putting in Massachusetts as a resident state, it turns out that we get this message that says, congratulations, you qualify for $308 a month in food stamps. And since that's frequently a measure for other programs, the message also states that you probably qualify for electrical assistance, for gas assistance, and for even phone assistance. What's the difference between the two states? I mean, I know the difference is going to be the tax base and the way taxes are raised. But what's the difference in the way we are treating this group of individuals? I also took a look today at what's going on in my own agency right here in the Upper Valley. And I was told by a crisis counselor that she had a representative payee client. This is someone who, for one reason or another, is not able to handle their own funds. So they come to our agency, and we take care of receiving their disability check or even their retirement check and paying it out slowly to make certain we balance their budget. This individual had received a letter from the state of New Hampshire several months ago telling them that they qualified for food stamps to the tune of $173 a month. But when they came in yesterday to talk about it, they had made a phone call from home to find out when they could start to access that benefit. And during that conversation, they were told their benefit had been cut from $173 a month to $71 a month. Now, the toll on that individual is immense because they don't know how they're going to survive going through the year with $71 a month to help them with their food budget. I called DHHS to ask them why this was happening. And it seems like the more questions you ask, the more questions you have. DHHS told me that it was a federal mandate coming down through the state that utility assistance would be reduced. And utility assistance ties directly to food stamp assistance. So if you have a reduction in utilities, there's going to be a follow-up reduction in food stamp assistance. Well, at the same time that that's the explanation, I was told an email came through in the last 24 hours stating that that was in error. And now letters have to go out again to all of these recipients telling them that they will have their benefit as it was for October, November, and December. But in December, another letter will go out telling them that as of January 2011, that's when they can expect the reduction. Once again, the frustration, the fear, the insecurity, the depression, the despair that comes with that news is a burden that's very difficult to quantify dollars and cents. Although I bet if you had the time to chase it down, you'd be able to determine that what it's doing to their health and to their quality of life and the quality of life of their families in a long-term situation, you can figure out the cost to the household. I've also found out that 45% of all children eligible for dental care because of low-income households are 45% of those, I'm sorry, of the 100% that are eligible, only 45% are accessing the service. And we need to find out why that's happening. In one instance, I think it's happening because it reduces the responsibility of the state to pick up that expense. In Sullivan County, there is a benefits office. In Grafton County, there is not a benefits office. That means people in Grafton County who need food stamps or need any other sort of TANF assistance, any of the assistance programs, the utility or the phone, they need to leave Grafton County and go to Sullivan County to find that assistance. And the effect that that has is that probably 30%, if not more, of those individuals who qualify for that assistance don't access it because they don't know exactly where the office is. They can't take time off from work to go to the office. Taking time off for work is money out of their pocket. They're not paid for not being present. And so they don't take advantage of the benefit. And the long-term effect of all of these reductions in supports for low-income folks, for people with disabilities, for the elderly, is that it takes a toll on their mental and physical health. And the cost of that, we all end up paying ultimately. As Brian said, if you are having mental health issues and you don't have the support to receive mental health assistance and you can't afford because you don't have the medical insurance that you need, you do end up at DHMC. And that costs all of us because it goes to our insurance. Or if you are a young family and you're a father who's out of work and you're not getting the food stamp support that you need, the calculator's telling you that for some unknown reason you don't qualify, even though the rest of us know that if you only have $3,000 at the end of the year to spread across 12 months to make ends meet, that's poverty. And we're not recognizing poverty as it really exists. Well, those individuals, when they get frustrated and they get angry, they turn to alcohol, they turn to drugs, and then that turns sometimes to crime. And the county jails are filling up, as Brian alluded to. And the cost of that is close to $23,000 a year for every individual that we put into jail. So from the perspective of Listen Community Services, what's the most cost-effective thing to do? And I always think it's to go upstream, not to catch everything as it's crashing at the bottom of the waterfall, but to catch everything before it goes over the edge of that waterfall. But we're not really doing that in the state of New Hampshire, and I understand why. The burden of doing that falls once again on that broad base tax. Now, as a select person, I've also seen the outcome of shifting the burden to the property owners when you are a low income or a fixed income property owner. Prior to this meeting, we were having a little discussion in the conference room, and as a select person in 2008, the town of Cornish saw 5 pieces of property come across the table by tax deed. And it was one of the most difficult things, as difficult as seeing this individual who should be getting food stamps, but who is being told you don't qualify. It's even more difficult to find out that someone on low income or fixed income living in a mobile home on 5 acres has to lose that because his limited income is not able to keep up with the $100, $200, $300 a year tax increases that we're seeing on the property tax. It's a complex question, and I understand the complexities of it. I just know that the way we're doing things now, people are getting hurt, and it's always at the low end of the scale, fixed or low income. They're either not getting services, or in order to get services, people who own property are losing their homes. And so there needs to be some more equity that we bring to the table. I don't know exactly what the answer is. Like I said, I'm not an economist. I just deal with the day-to-day, endless trail of people coming in, and I understand that the last 2 or 3 years has driven some of this up. In 2009, we saw about a 40% increase in individuals coming in looking for assistance because they either didn't have a job, their hours were cut, or their wage was cut. So that's another tax. It's a tax. The people who write checks to support agencies such as Listen, the towns that help fund us like Hanover and Lebanon and Canaan, those towns are paying an additional tax because we're doing the state's work. And without us there are 1,000 families in the Upper Valley who would not have a resource because the state resource isn't there. So what's the price of not taking care of the elderly, the young, the disabled, and the poor? I think the price is very high in quality of life and the ripple effect that it has on the entire community. It affects the structure of everyone's community when we don't take care of those people who need us the most. But I leave it to the experts to decide how best to do that. Thank you.
Let me relay an anecdote to you as a way of transiting to the next part of the program. I arrived here in 1969 as a very young member of the Department of Government. And one of my senior colleagues, Frank Smallwood, I think was elected senator, state senator from Windsor, Orange County, one of the state senate districts, I think in 1970. And I can remember walking across the green and into the Hopkins Center with Frank one day, and this might have been in the '72 campaign. And Frank and I were talking about sort of Vermont versus New Hampshire, and I shook my head and I said to Frank, Frank, I just don't understand how New Hampshire can continue as it has with the way in which it budgets. And he turns to me and he says, well, Dick, let's put this in perspective. I arrived in Hanover in 1950 as a freshman at Dartmouth College. I arrived here before Wilder Dam was constructed. New Hampshire has survived for the last 2 decades just fine, and I expect it will for the foreseeable future. Now, the embarrassing thing about that, of course, is that it has survived for 4 more decades after that conversation that I had with Frank Smallwood. Now, the implications of what I hear this afternoon is these panelists don't see continuing as before as a reasonable solution. So the question for the panel, my inference from what I hear is continuing does not strike them as a reasonable solution. But the record of the last 60 years suggests that that's been the resolution. So if they genuinely believe that continuing is not possible, then what are, in some sense, the alternatives, and how would they sketch out the kind of plausible alternatives? Now, in some sense, there's an empirical aspect to the plausible alternative. That is, what's possible politically, and we can make conjectures about that. But at the same time, what I detect, certainly in Brian's comments and in Marilyn's comments, is they don't see this as an empirical political question. It's also a moral and a philosophical question here of not what's practical in terms of adoption, but rather what they think ought to be done. That is, it's a moral and a philosophical issue of what ought to be done. And I'm interested in what their preferences are with respect to what ought to be done. And a final kind of observation here that I'd be interested in them wrestling with is that Cathy is directing the Fair Tax Coalition. So I would think in some moral and philosophical analysis, fairness would be one of the values that they might be interested in. But the question really is, how would you define, or how would the panelists define fairness in terms of changes in spending, changes in revenue? But the issue really has to do with fairness, and how would they characterize a move from where we are presently to a fairer, and they mean by that what? A fairer set of outcomes for the citizens of New Hampshire. Reactions?
I thought you were going to ask those questions, 3 separate questions, rather than give us a tarball to deal with.
There's already a tarball.
I want to take the easiest end of it first, and it's not the solution, but it's a piece that hasn't been pointed out enough. If you remember Steve's graph about the 5 fastest growing parts of the state budget and the crowding out on the other side, let's think about what's been crowded out. LCHIP's been crowded out. Much of help for the mentally disabled has been crowded out. We're talking about selling our state parks. Oh my goodness, thank God the feds tied us up in some long-term easements, so if we sell them, we have to give the feds back the money. But we're talking about doing absolutely crazy things like that, that take things that we as a state have built over a century and selling them off to fill a short-term hole. And I think the short-term versus the mid-term versus the long-term is the really important part here. And this, again, is apologies to my state legislators. The state budget usually is put to bed around June 38th or July 45th, somewhere in there. But it's at 11:59. Thank you, Bernie. And we have at least 2 sitting members of the House Finance Committee here, so they can vouch for me. But if you look at the process all through the legislation, it's interesting. There's a distance between the programmatic legislative decisions that are made on the one hand and the finance decisions that are made on the other hand. They're different committees. And then if you look at it, it crosses over from the House to the Senate and the Senate to the House. And there's no clarity, as far as I can see in that process, of connecting any long-term view to the funding decisions. So we get to a set of budgetary compromises at the last minute where I will bet almost any one of the legislators who's voting for that bill is voting out of exhaustion rather than out of knowledge. And that's not a really good way to set long-term public policy. We need to find a way where the legislature has the ability to look at the consequences of their legislative decisions over a 5-year period or a 10-year period economically, and then look at the revenue that's required to deliver on that. The debate we're having now about parole in this state, it costs a hell of a lot of money to keep somebody in prisons, but it's also easy to stand up and say, oh, we ought to keep the bastards in as long as their sentence is there. And there's no connection between what that's costing us as a taxpayer and what that's crowding out of the state budget, between that sloganeering and what's really going on. So we need a new way in the state legislature to deal with the connection between money and programs. And we need a new way to have a conversation as the electorate, where we can talk about not just slogans. And quite frankly, I have trouble with the Fair Tax Coalition just as I have trouble with the pledge. We've got to be able to talk in content at a broad level, and we've got to be able to ask our legislators as they're running for election, what do you really believe in? Where is the trade-off between revenue and expenses? Maybe one step down, dealing with Medicaid, dealing with corrections, but it doesn't have to go down to the details we went to. We've got to talk differently in this state, both publicly and legislatively, or we're going to keep this dance going for a much longer time. That's my answer.
So I get to retreat behind the label of being an economist, but I will say that much of the conversation is one about people's moral perspective of what should and shouldn't be done as a state. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your position there, we have created exactly what the state wants. We are a democracy, and people vote people in, and we have made those decisions. And so part of the question that, as an economist, I ask myself, moving forward, are the characteristics of the incentives that everyone's found themselves in changed enough for a different set of decisions to occur? I would argue that if you look over the history of New Hampshire, you look over the last two recessions, and you look at the Republican response and the Democratic response, there's virtually no difference. So we're getting almost what we want. So the question I think that we have to struggle one is the one that Brian asked very eloquently, and that is, are we interested in doing something differently? And if we are, what has to happen to make those conversations occur in a different way than they've occurred in the past? I personally believe we have a poor understanding of the implications of our state spending on the residents, and that it will be very hard for us to make any strong decisions one way or another without understanding the implications of changes in spending. The nature of New Hampshire is conservative, low spending, that's culturally bound up in everything, and that the way you can have a realistic conversation is to say, well, what are we getting for our money? And what is happening when we are changing the social contract, if you will, that we've established with local communities through the Meals and Rooms distribution, et cetera, or to the citizens that have come to expect a certain set of services from us. That's a hard nut to crack.
Marilyn, you want to make any further?
Well, the more I looked at this question, the more questions I had. It's very complex, and I do think that Brian stated it very, very well. What I look at historically, I went backwards to figure how did we get here. In 1969, the state of New Hampshire was one of 5 states in the country who did not provide food stamp benefits to their low-income poverty residents. And if we're carrying on a tradition that dates back that far about the people are getting and giving exactly what they want to get and give, I don't know what the answer is if that's their perspective, if that's their desire is to, you know, survival of the strongest, survival of the fittest. New Hampshire has the lowest poverty rate in the country. And I don't know what's driving that. Is it lack of services for low income? The fact that people who are on fixed or low income end up leaving because they can't keep up with the property tax, since that's the only way services are funded, and they're paying an awfully large portion of their annual income just for their property taxes. I know a lot of people who pay more for their property tax monthly than they do for their mortgage, so they're a little upside down that way. I don't know what the answer is, but if we believe in taking care of people and watching out for the low fixed income individuals, it seems to me we can't, well, we could. I suppose if that's everyone's will, we can go on this way forever, and we'll have no poverty level in this state at all, because those individuals will have to leave. But if that's my son or my mother or my sister, I'm not going to feel good about that. And that's a moral issue that I have.
And I want to amplify on what both Steve and Marilyn said. We can't see the consequences of the budgetary decisions that get made in Concord. We can see the consequences in terms of the slogan, no new taxes. And we can see the consequences in the names of new programs that are created when they're created. We don't really see it when they're zero funded. They just sort of sit out there. But we can't see, as the state retreats from mental health or drug and alcohol counseling or the court system or doesn't take on the retirement system, we can't see what those other consequences are to human beings and to our municipalities. And that's the hard part that keeps us from having the conversation, because we can't see what's happening.
And it's answering that question is fascinating. Writing a couple of notes here on what can people do to understand the implications of all these changes. Well, the Local Government Center put out a survey of all local communities, and the implications of the most recent set of changes in the state budget affecting local communities was that they're spending out of their special reserve funds, and they are not investing in capital development activities that they might otherwise do. Those are the implications of the changes that Brian talked about, which is about $70 million. Not a small amount of money to take away from local communities. And the response has been those two: fewer capital investment and spending down special reserves. That may not be sufficient to change behavior.
But I just got to take this whack at the $70 million, if you'll excuse me.
Well, you can blow it up or blow it down.
No, I want to take a different whack
Okay.
at it.
Okay.
So the state announced yesterday that there was a $70 million surplus at the end of the fiscal year. That's a good number. That's approximately equal to the municipal revenue sharing, which was taken out of the state budget, which was the primary reason for the town of Hanover's 2.5% tax rate increase in both of those years. So I ask you, is that a state surplus, or is that a state surplus funded by a broad-based tax, which just happens to be the property tax?
Let's move to an exchange between the panel, among the panel and the audience. I'm going to be moderating the questions and answer, and if you go on for too long, at my age, I'm perfectly happy to cut you off and reformat and re-ask your question in the way you should have asked it, but didn't. But in any case, I'm perfectly happy to lend an iron fist to the discussion. But let's open it up. And this young man in the front row here has got a question.
Do I need a mic?
Right there.
Thank you. To me, a functioning democracy, which America pretends it is, must have an informed electorate. In other words, we must have a sober, ranging discussion with all the people in the state so they understand what's going on. Brian said that we can't see the effects. People are not showing the effects, and people don't listen. With all due regard to listen, but we must have an informed electorate, and that requires a rational discussion.
I would say there are a lot of initiatives across the state, some out of the University of New Hampshire, trying to do learning circles, deliberative democracy, creating institutions and structures that allow people to become more informed of those types of changes. But they're pretty early in their development. But there's a general recognition among my board, for example, that we need to find better ways of infusing the policy conversation, not just the legislature, not just the Brian Walshes and the like, but people who are not necessarily a part of that in a circle, who need to understand the implications of their decisions more clearly. But it's relatively early.
Yes.
Thank you, Ruth Blyler. I've heard a lot about expenses up here and where the money is going and where we need the money. Heaven, we really do need it. What are we doing about revenue? We can't do the broad-based sales tax or whatever, or the elephant in the house being income tax. But what are we going to do with this property tax? How are we going to increase that to pay for these things that we all want, which Brian, you have stated, and so has Marilyn, but where is this money going to come from? We need some discussion on revenue.
I can tell you historically where we've gotten it. I mean, as that chart that I showed you, the difference between the $500 million and the 1.3 are new taxes. And so we're not a state that doesn't create new taxes. We raise tax rates, we create new taxes, we create new fees, and that's the approach that we have historically taken. In this most recent recession, we increased the rates in the meals and rooms tax. We, as a state, contemplated implementing the LLC tax, implemented it, and pulled it back through a rather amazing process to watch from the outside. That's the way we have managed it in the past. And don't underestimate the amount of revenue that has been raised that way. I think that oftentimes in the conversations about revenue, the sales tax and the income tax conversation are masquerading as a conversation about the fact that people want to increase spending. Let's be clear whether we want to increase spending or whether we want a tax system that fundamentally is different. If we're interested in fairness from an economic perspective and ensuring that taxes are a function of your personal income or your ability to pay, that's a different set of questions. You can make the property tax a more progressive tax. And in fact, many communities have for the elderly and you communities can do as much as they'd like. But you also do that with a sales tax, with an income tax. So I would just say that let's be clear about what it is that we're asking. We don't have a problem raising revenue when we want to, but we can also have another conversation, which is about changing underlying tax structure, which is a good conversation to have, but different than the one about the level of spending.
Yeah, I'll agree. Revenue clearly needs to be on the table. In fact, it should be on the table where the state's raising it. I mean, there is a statewide property tax right now. We do have a broad-based tax that funds the state. It funds part of the state's education obligation, and it funds the death by 1,000 cuts, which I've been describing up here. Maybe one way to make this visible is to have the legislature, in fact, recognize that they have a statewide property tax and have the state of New Hampshire send out the bill so that as it's put into the budget, we recognize that the state legislature in fact is using a broad-based tax, in fact is increasing it every year, and in fact is collecting it themselves. And that would change the conversation from having me send the state's tax bill out to you all, at least the Hanover residents, and the other selectmen, and it would start putting some light on how we're using broad-based taxes at the state level now anyway. By the way, I'm for an income tax. This is not me ducking that, but I am more for us having a conversation that leads somewhere. And I think the structural deficit and both the expense and revenue side needs to be in that conversation. It's not just about jumping up and down with the 40% of the people in the state who believe in an income tax and getting it up to 42%, because that's not going to get us anywhere as a state.
As a 25-year resident of Hanover and a recipient of property tax bills on a regular basis from Hanover, I always thought that we ought to get those tax bills from Hanover on parchment paper, given the size of the bill, but he always used to send them out on Kleenex kind of paper. I mean, the most flimsiest kind of bills. Yes, young man. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Arthur Stout, and to me it seems simple after listening to you, and I mean, I have my own opinions about this, but we have almost an $800 million hole, which has been created by a 24% increase by the folks in control in Concord, mainly since 2006 when the Democrats took control. My question is, do you agree that it's the right thing to do to raise taxes during a recession?
I'm going to take on a very specific tax to start with, because it's one that's near and dear to my heart. And I want you all to make a guess first. When do you think the last time was the state of New Hampshire raised the gasoline tax? And I'm going to give you the answer to that question in a minute. So we have a state whose highway trust fund is virtually broke. We have a 10-year highway program plan that we put into place, and we go through the Executive Council virtually every biennium, or maybe it's every 5 years, I'm not sure. And that always stretches out to 30 years, and with things that are redlined. And its primary source of funding is the gasoline tax. And the second side of the gasoline tax is it's been shown as one of the best ways to go after greenhouse emissions and one of the best ways to go after reducing energy consumption in this country. Well, the last time we increased the gasoline tax in this state was in 1991. And there was a effort in last year's legislature to increase it by, my goodness, 5 cents a year for each of the next 3 years. And I think we're something like 50 cents lower than Massachusetts. I'm not sure about that number, but it's an interesting one. And that failed. This isn't about a recession. This is about not having the will to tax ourselves even for those things that are on their face obvious. Now, I agree, it's tough to increase taxes in a recession, but let's recognize the fact that we have to even have this conversation in a recession is because we haven't been in a place to have the conversation when things were in good times. And that's when we should have had it, but we still have to have the conversation.
I'm not sure you answered my question.
I thought I did.
How this has been created is the fact that they increased the budget from $9.3 billion to $11.5 billion while revenues were going down. So you have two things crossing at the same time. So I'm not sure you answered my question. Basically you did. You said that you do think that it is the right thing to do to raise taxes during a recession.
I basically said we should have had this conversation in the
But
past.
We're not talking about the past. We're talking about right now.
And
so if I could
what's
just
the right thing to do in the
Can I just
now and
describe
in
the
future?
situation so that the sort of what we're talking about, we're mixing apples and oranges a little bit. For those of you who heard, I was on public radio trying to describe the difference between John Stevens' estimates of the budget changes and Governor Lynch's, and it's become a very politicized issue, and some of this has to do with that. 24% increase represents a change in total funds. And the exposure that the state faces right now is that we have funded those services largely through federal funds. We have that pot of money that I said that is going to come due in the next budget biennium. And the question that we all have to ask is, how big is that going to be? I put our estimates up there between $250 million and $600 million. There is going to be a problem that's a function of both spending changes and the recession. And we are going to have a conversation in the next budget, as we did in the past, about revenues and spending. That's what history suggests. And so in order for us to have that conversation, we all need to understand the dynamic. The money that we're talking about here, the taxation, is a very different number than the 24%. That was a totally different state-generated tax number. It's not the 24%. So how are we as a state going to fill that hole, whether it's $250 or $800 million is really the question. We have to answer that before we get to the place where we decide we need to have any taxation. Is the federal government going to increase its stimulus money or maintain its stimulus money? If it does, then that deficit estimate is half what it was. Is that a good assumption, a bad assumption? I don't know. I'm asking for clarity in the conversation. And I think, unfortunately, in the political system, it's very difficult, especially closely around election. It's somewhat unfortunate, frankly, these conversations are going on around election, to have this realistic conversation. In the political world, it's very difficult to reduce spending at the level that you would have to make the types of changes that we're talking about. Just to give you an example, $800 million is almost the entire general fund portion of the state's Medicaid program. That's the type of spending change you're asking about. And while we absolutely could do that, and there would be support for that, there are likely consequences for that we have to understand, and we don't yet understand those things. So I would caution us all to be very clear about what all these numbers mean and get a good sense of the consequences before we get to what types of taxes or what types of spending changes we really need to employ.
The other thing that we can look at, and I'll try to be more direct with your question, is what happened in the last biennium. In the last biennium, we closed a hole that was somewhere, if I remember the numbers, between $300 and $500 million at the starters. We closed that hole with a combination of money that flowed in from the federal government, thank goodness. I agree. I have the same trouble with using one-time money that you do that way, and with increasing taxes. bits and pieces here and there, kicking and screaming, and with cutting programs or changing the numbers or unfunding them. So it was the mix, which is the way we always do it. So we've raised taxes in a recession before. It's just not taxes with big names and broad smiles. We go after it with you know, a little bit of tobacco, a little bit of alcohol. Perhaps we can go after beer, maybe the fishing license. Let's see, the entrance to the state park. Oh, maybe we can lease the whole state park. Perhaps.
That's fine, but you can't increase your budget by 24% while you're doing that. You expect a balanced budget. It's just not going to work.
Other questions? Yes, Martha.
I'm going to be quiet for a while. You guys take over.
We've, in the discussion part of this meeting, been doing what the legislature does, which is to talk about the numbers. And it seems to me the voices we aren't hearing are those of the Maryland-borns of the community. We need somebody who will take the moral leadership role and hold the mirror up and show us what we are doing to our state, so that our decisions can come from our knowledge of the consequences, as Brian suggests, rather than just whether this column is going to get bigger or smaller.
Yeah, you know, I don't have the perspective that these two gentlemen have. I don't have the experience or the exposure. I deal with it on a daily basis, feet on the ground, and I just take a look at what's going on in my life and what's going on in the lives of people around me. And this is what I know. My property taxes have increased by 24% in the past 5 years. Now, that might not be everyone's experience. Cornish is going through a spurt of interest from the real estate agents, and it's driving prices up, and this is affecting everyone across the board in the town. All I know is that the way we're funding our expenses now, our revenues, where's the money coming from? 61% of it comes from property tax. In my book, I feel like I'm funding everything in the state, and the other guy on the street feels the same way. We can't continue to do it that way because my property tax burden far exceeds my mortgage burden, and this year alone it went up $200–300, and we're looking in the town of Cornish in 2013 at losing $400,000. We used to be a receiving town, whatever that means. So you pay your state education tax, and if you're lucky, you get some of it back as a town. Well, we're losing $400,000. Claremont's going to get an increase, and they need it. But the people in Cornish are helping to fund that. And how much longer can people on fixed and low income in that town continue? Like I said, the poverty rate is the lowest in the state of any place in the country. Is that because people who are on fixed and low income can't afford to stay here? Is that what we've come to?
Yes.
Dr. Townsend, one way that we keep the New Hampshire taxes low, the tax per capita low, is by funding a lot, by providing a lot of the social contract services through nonprofit organizations. And that has some very nice benefits for the state because it means that nonprofits are taking care of some services which in many states are taken care of through the state. The employees are paid at less than professional wages because they're working for nonprofits. The nonprofits can beg towns and local population for some of the money. But I wonder if we keep on reducing Medicaid reimbursement and taking it out of the nursing homes and hospitals and reducing West Central Services reimbursement and on, are we in a situation which is unsustainable using this model, or is this something which you see that we can continue to do?
So the question really has to do with sort of the nonprofit alternative as a possible social solution. Let me just interject here, and it's an interesting question. I'd be happy to get this information for you. You make the proposition that New Hampshire citizens are in fact more generous to the private nonprofit sector relative to other states' populations. That's a hypothetical, and I'm not sure I personally agree with that assessment.
I don't think that was the proposition, Dick, and it went through my mind first. I think the proposition was that we ask nonprofits to do things that are state responsibilities and expect them to raise the funds. It wasn't about the citizens being more generous. It was about a request from the state and the nonprofits at some level raising funds from generous people or ungenerous people. But it wasn't about our level of generosity.
But the assumption is that the nonprofit sector in New Hampshire is bigger and more robust relative to other states. As a byproduct, it's the opposite of the crowding out problem. As a byproduct of the state shirking its obligations, is it in fact the case that the nonprofit sector enlarges as a result of the default of the state? I mean, that's an interesting empirical question, and I don't know the answer to that, but it's not resolved in my mind. But any other reactions?
Well, I have a comment. I don't think it's what the state is mandating. I think it's just what happens. The state sees that agencies like Listen, like Headrest, pick up when the state human services pull back. And that works beautifully for the state. And so we end up taking on more and more responsibility all the time. But as I said earlier tonight, that's a tax. Because it's a tax by choice. Because when I send out, or other nonprofits send out an appeal letter, 10% of the population is saying, yeah, I vote for that and I'm going to fund you. So we're doing the state's work. It's just another form of tax.
And I just add a point of clarification. The state of New Hampshire, depending on the year, I think the year I'm talking about, was 4th lowest on a per capita expenditure basis. And people may gasp at that, but also remember that we have the lowest poverty rate in the country. So when you normalize spending by this potential measure of demand, we spend about what the rest of the country spends. When you look at our correction spending, we spend more per inmate than the average in the country. And when you look at Medicaid, we spend more than average. Now, it's up to other people to make a decision about whether that's an appropriate or inappropriate level of spending, but that's just a point of information so that you're grounded in the reality of what the state is putting out there for the services that it has contracted with.
Yes.
Steve, you mentioned that people tend to change their economic behavior when the incentives are changed. Could you share with us your thoughts on how you would see some possible scenarios of the incentives changing so that people would recognize the burden on them and then begin thinking differently of a different tax structure?
Boy. Is there a political scientist in the room? I guess what I would say, I don't have, that's a hard answer. I can tell you organizationally what we try and do. We try and clarify the conversation so that everyone has to be held accountable to the implications of their decisions in some fashion. Will that hold? We're trying to infuse the budgetary conversation with a measure of understanding of consequences, positive and negative, that doesn't currently exist. But whether that fundamentally changes the incentive structure that the legislature faces or that those in the community experience, I can't say. Probably not.
I can give you a little example, and this is, again, with apology to the legislators in the room, and there's no accusation of malfeasance here. But I want to tell you how the county budgeting process works. You've probably spent a lot of time focusing on your county budget, right? You elect your county representatives, they go up to Haverhill, they spend a lot of time with the county administrator going over the budget, and then there are public hearings, and then the budget gets massaged and passed, right? Wrong. Yeah. The county budget gets set, and your county legislature happens to be the legislators who you send to Concord. And they vote on a day to pass the county budget or not. Now, I gotta tell you, this strikes me as a pretty bizarre system. If I sat in Concord and wanted to put off some expenses so that they didn't show up in statewide taxes, and I could put them down at the county level. And then I could go vote for them at the county level, and lo and behold, they'd get lost in the property tax bill that the town sent out. That sure would be a nice way to send taxes or send expenses away from the state. Now, I'm not saying anybody does that consciously, but I think some of that happens unconsciously because it's easy. It's just not a piece, it's a place where there's not a degree of accountability at the county level that we need.
Yes.
Hi, Randy Foose, member of the House Finance Committee and a member of the Merrimack County delegation. So let me just start with the county process that you just described. Bears no resemblance to what I have lived with in Merrimack County for the last 6 years, where the county delegation holds budget hearings, breaks the budget down, assigns individual portions of the budget to small groups of legislators, then comes back and presents a preliminary budget to an executive committee, holds a public hearing, and then comes back and presents the budget and goes through a process that, in my experience, having chaired the New London Budget Committee for a decade, is probably more thorough and more participatory than what I helped happen in New London. So it may be that well, clearly you're describing a different county, but don't characterize it as the only way that counties build budgets. I would love to hear people's thoughts on a couple of issues. One is that as I have worked with a legislature, particularly in the context of both the Finance Committee and the Committee of Conference that crafted the final budget that we're living with right now, I felt as though I was working with a group of people who took their responsibilities very carefully, who conducted hearings, and in the last several years the hearings extended not just to programs in Concord, but the budget actually was taken on the road and presented at various locations around the state in the spirit of attempting to develop and encourage the dialogue that I think has to happen to get to where we all want to be, and that is a very careful consideration of some new ways of doing things. Along the way, I have also come to believe very strongly that when you ask the question, what are the core competencies, what are the essential services that government ought to be providing and paying for, there is no concerted effort anywhere in my travels to identify things that the state shouldn't be doing. In fact, as we made very difficult decisions this past year, the way that has played out in this conversation is to hear your very strong comments against cutting LCHIP, cutting the state parks, cutting all of the other the smaller areas where we did take actions. Some of us even closed our district courts and are paying a political price. So the question is, how do you help the conversation? I don't think you help the conversation by painting the legislature as the organization that is doing everything for the wrong reasons, that is impacting communities. I do think that using your strength and your connections on a local level, we ought to be looking at ways in which we can facilitate the conversation among the state legislature and local communities. I don't have the answers on how to do it. Some people would argue that by electing legislators every 2 years, that's the best way to get us to be responsive. I'm not sure that the students of government would agree with that. But I'd encourage us to think about that. And then one final point, I am absolutely convinced that a weakness of our structure, and I think Steve tries to bring this up whenever it's appropriate is that we don't have the capacity to talk and think about things on anything more than a 2-year basis. And that the minute we elect all aspects of state government, the issue becomes, how are we going to get reelected in 2 years, and how are we going to make decisions in the short term without paying any attention to the longer term consequence. And if there is help that people can give the dialogue, give our democracy on how to have multi-year conversations. At the local level, that played out, in my experience, with a 10-year capital plan in New London, looking at major expenses over a multiple year period. But we don't do that other than with the capital budget, and that, as we all know, became politicized the last time around.
I want to start out by apologizing, Randy. I want to apologize on the county piece. I was talking about something structural there, and thank you for that. I think what you tried to do in terms of having public conversations and conversations about what the state should or should not be involved in was a good process and needs to happen more. I think there also needs to be a connection there, though, between revenue raising and the state going out of certain businesses. Because I think the question to the public is not should the state be in the state parks business or not, or be in the L-chip business or not. Though that's a reasonable question to ask in lots of places. But it's, well, when we put L-chip in to start with, or you did, there was a dedicated source of funding for it, hopefully to protect it. And so the conversation about the state going out of the state parks business needs also to include the question of, well, if we had a revenue structure that didn't annually have this deficit that squeezed the good stuff out, would it be worth it? What would we get out of it? Like Kearsarge Mountain, like Sunapee State Park, and it just goes on. And I think that choice needs to be visible, not just whether the state should be in it. And I think that choice would lead to a more constructive conversation. So I think you were on a good direction there, and we need more of it.
In principle, we were supposed to end at 6 o'clock. So maybe is there one last question that we can, or maybe we can call the conversation to a close. And let me close it actually with
there was a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There are two actually.
Okay.
Gentlemen, I
yes.
Can't see.
Mr. Norton, during your PowerPoint presentation, you were showing what parts of the budget were rising so that we had to cut other parts.
Yep.
And I noticed the big drivers were things like Medicaid and I believe retirement programs.
Yes.
So it seems to me that what was going on is that we have entitlement spending that is rising faster than the state's natural base budget level from taxes. So I was wondering if you knew what's driving those increases in entitlement spending, and are there ways we could reform those in order to cut the gap in the budget?
Sure. Well, first of all, there are very few things in the state budget that are actually non-discretionary. Even the Medicaid program is a state option. We don't have to participate in it. It's a pretty significant source of resources for the state's healthcare industry, but that particular program is being driven by the size of the population and the cost of medical care. The size of the population, our hands are tied to some extent because of additional federal dollars that we took from the ARA stimulus money. We can't change that. Medicaid reimbursements, as you know, for those of you who are associated with Dartmouth, have been slowly ratcheted back. The retirement system is driven by the state laws around the contribution levels, and one of the things that Brian mentioned early on is the states reshaping the social contract or the financial contract that they've created with the local communities about how much they're going to pay. It was originally created to encourage the municipalities to offer retirement, and it's sort of a holdover from that time period. School building aid is a function of aging capital plant. Catastrophic aid is a function of the ongoing and increasing cost of educating those severely disabled children and others who have needs for education services by federal and state law. You can change any one of those things by law. You can change it in the budgetary process, but they are, to some extent, sacred cows. And I think one of the questions that is going to have to be answered before many of these questions about tax structure and other things are we triaging, are we actually getting the outcomes we want from those very big expenditures? Of the $1.3 billion, don't quote me on that particular number, that we're spending on Medicaid, is that the amount, are we buying what we want with that amount? And I think those types of conversations are going to come up even more strongly in this next legislative session. I don't know if that completely answered your question, but.
Okay. Steve also had identified one other hand.
There's a gentleman on the end. I think he's got a blue shirt on, yes.
Ah, okay, yeah.
First of all, I'd have to commend the folks down there because they've done things that I haven't done over my lifetime, and not only they're doing a good job of it, but it's essential, so I just personally appreciate it. I hate to be the last one. What happens when a taxpayer runs into trouble? And if this is the new, we may be having more and more taxpayers running into trouble. I've seen them sell their house, maybe buy something smaller and move in with somebody. I've seen them sell their nice cars and get clunkers. I've seen them take their kids out of private school. I've seen them stop going out to eat. I've seen them stop buying clothes. Those are the persons that you're dependent upon. And if this is the new, you might have to look at one other strategy long term, and it might be, boy, we're just not going to get what we want from the federal government, and we're not going to be able to raise taxes. Not saying that in a political way, we might be in a new.
Well, that's a very nice counterpoint to Martha's.
You got to let Susan speak. I mean,
okay,
or ask or whatever. I mean, it would not be fun to cut her off.
I'm chair of Ways and Means. Just two things. One, everything Steve mentioned that is discretionary is only discretionary in a sense. If we take Medicaid, there's all kinds of, almost everything we're doing we have to do. And everything that you mentioned, I believe, if we decide not to do it at the state level, is going to have to be done at the local level. And that's the property tax again. So if we're talking about cutting the state budget, we are talking about increasing our 61, 67, whatever it is right now, percentage dependence on property taxes. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the spending levels that you're talking about are what is in the budget, and we clearly spent a lot less than that as the recession hit further and the revenues went down. So, thanks.
Let me finish up with just with thanks to the panelists. They've done a magnificent job. Thank you very much. But let me, and Cathy probably will have a few words of closing as well, but let me leave you with one anecdote. The very first thing I ever wrote actually the second thing I wrote and published was an article back in 1974, really trying to account for the differences between spending in New Hampshire and the spending in Vermont. And by the early 1970s, the differences were really quite profound. What's interesting about that, two things that are interesting about that, is if you actually trace it backwards in time to, for example, the late 1940s, just looking at general fund revenues per capita, New Hampshire and Vermont were practically indistinguishable in the middle pack of the 50 states. So something happened over that, that last half century plus here. And if you really trace it out decade by decade, you'll see Vermont gradually rising and Vermont gradually sinking towards the bottom of the 50 states. And it's sort of an interesting question that states really can change their behavior. Okay, they can do things differently than they have done before. The new may be there, but nevertheless, Martha makes the point that there really may be a moral argument that could be made on one side or the other side, and we need to think about that. In discussion before this panel, Marilyn raised a point about when we could make choices and had made choices and in some sense failed to make choices. And I pushed her on this because I thought she was talking about the early 1970s when an income tax bill was introduced in the New Hampshire Senate and House by Rob Trowbridge from the Keene, Jaffrey, Peterborough area and Jack Mengy representing Lyme and Hanover, and it failed. And she was actually talking about a more recent period when Governor Shaheen was governor. But there's a very little known anecdote about New Hampshire politics. So let me leave you with this that you can mull over at dinner this evening. Back in, I think it was in 1948, Sherman Adams was elected. I think it was 48. He was elected governor in New Hampshire. And he was reelected in 1950 and led the sort of the campaign to get Dwight Eisenhower the nomination in 1952. And at the beginning of his second term, I think he was reelected, he introduced HB 1. This is an anecdote relayed to me by John Pillsbury. Some of you know him from the Plymouth area, New Hampshire Rural Electric Co-op, who was in the state legislature at the time. House Bill 1, which Governor Adams had the Senate in his pocket. And HB 1 was to institute in the state of New Hampshire a sales tax and an income tax. And it was going to pass the Senate, though the Senate would vote second. And it failed in the House by 4 votes. Okay? And, so it's a little known factoid about New Hampshire history. Just sort of ponder what the differences would have been had Governor Adams been able to change 2 more minds, 3 more minds in that. We would really be having a very different discussion here this evening. So states make choices. They're very often incremental choices that are made every 2 years with individuals making decisions in the context of re-election incentives that they're facing 18 months, 12 months, 6 months down the pike. But states do make choices, and I think that's the situation that we're in today is to consider what we want to do. So thank you very much, and here's Cathy for some final comments.
Thank you, Dick. My papers have disappeared. Someone else's papers have supplanted them. Well, you know what? I don't need papers. I just want to thank you. First of all, thank Dick, thank the panelists, thank yourselves for a very productive conversation. Please give yourselves a big hand. I also want to remind you to pick up some Granite State Fair Tax Coalition literature on the table outside. If you like what you've heard here today, if you think this kind of conversation needs to continue, I'd like to ask you to think about joining the coalition, and there's materials out there for you to do it. There are also some questions for candidates and office holders out there. If you, now's the time to ask these questions. And what else is out there? That's about it. Thanks very much.